So today we're going to talk about some issues related to ethics. Excuse me, issues related to addiction in bioethics. So some bioethical issues surrounding addiction, and in particular, we're going to look at the question of whether addicts should receive sort of lower priority for certain kinds of healthcare treatment. Um, and the two articles we're going to look at, these are from, I taught these articles previously, so this PowerPoint I'm using is from a previous class where I taught these articles. So I'll put this PowerPoint up on Canvas, and I'll put the reading notes that I have for both of these articles up as well as the articles. And they're kind of these two articles that are sort of dueling. One of them is from Walter Glannon. It's the first one here that we'll look at, and it is called Responsibility, Alcoholism, and Liver Transplantation. And roughly, he's going to argue that at least many addicts, and in particular alcoholics, that's kind of his focus, is alcoholics who need a liver transplant because their liver is failing because of their drinking. So the question is, should those alcoholics have lower priority than other people? And he's going to argue that they should for certain reasons that we'll talk about. So that's Walter Glannon. And then Dien Ho is the author of the other article that kind of responds to Glannon, and he disagrees. He thinks that they should not be given lower priority. And he responds to Glannon's argument in particular directly. And the name of his article is When Good Organs Go to Bad People. And it kind of sounds paradoxical because it sounds like he is going to argue that you shouldn't give organs to addicts, or at least they should get lower priority. But he's kind of saying that tongue in cheek a little bit. He's kind of saying that tongue in cheek. So that's kind of Glannon's view, is that these good organs are going to go to bad people, or at least that's the way Dien Ho sees Glannon's view. So in any case, we'll look at Glannon argue for the view that addicts or alcoholics, I guess, should receive lower priority on the liver transplantation list, and then Dien Ho will give an argument against Glannon. Okay, so all right. Now, if you're blameworthy for the healthcare that you need to receive, if you're responsible for needing healthcare, then Glannon is going to say you should have the priority of your healthcare. So where you're placed on the list of the priority list, right? Like if we should help you before someone else or someone else before you. If you're blameworthy for your condition, if you're responsible for needing the healthcare, that's going to matter. And in particular, if you're blameworthy, right, if you did something you shouldn't have done and that's why you need healthcare, Glannon's going to argue roughly that that means you should get lower priority. And so he's focusing on addiction, right? So what he's going to say is alcoholics should not get new livers. What he really means is should not get new livers before other people who are not responsible for the fact that they need a liver. Okay, so that's the question here. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about moral responsibility up front, just so we can have some issues on the table and just some questions to think about. And we're not going to solve any of these things. This is a really, deep and sort of complicated or complex literature on free will and moral responsibility. So we're just going to kind of braze over some issues just to bring them up so we know that there's some things, some details that we can't really get into. But just things for you to think about. If you want to write on this topic for your final essay, then this is just some stuff that you should keep in mind. So moral responsibility is just kind of central to the dispute between Walter Glannon and Dien Ho. Glannon is basically going to argue that alcoholics should get lower priority on the liver donation list because they're responsible for needing a liver transplant, because they're blameworthy, morally responsible, right? And Dien Ho is going to say moral responsibility is just not the kind of thing that we should be taking into account when we're wondering how we should sort of distribute healthcare resources. Right? So whether addicts are in fact morally responsible for their use and therefore their health problems that come from their use, their excessive use, I guess, usually. And two, even if they are responsible, should moral responsibility even be a factor that we consider when we're wondering how to distribute healthcare resources. So the moral responsibility is at the center of their debate here. Okay, and so there's a question: what does it take to be morally responsible? Right? What needs to happen? Do you need to exercise a certain amount of control? Do you need to have a certain amount of knowledge? What kinds of things are required? And I just want to note here that that's a matter of dispute. That is a question that people fight about in the moral responsibility of free will literature. What does it take? What are the conditions that need to be met in order to be morally responsible for your action? So think of a person performing an action, right? And then somebody else says, hey, they're blameworthy. They're morally responsible for that action. They deserve blame, or they deserve praise if it was a good action, right? The question here is, what does this person or other things involved in the action, what needs to have happened? And in particular, at least a main focus is, what does this person need to do or to be like when they perform that action in order to say that they're morally responsible for it? That's the question. What does it take to be morally responsible? And Glannon and Dien Ho don't really address any of that. They say a few things about this stuff, but they're just not in the business of getting into like really heavy disputes about moral responsibility. They're going to just gloss over it, say some sort of what they think are hopefully intuitive things, and then they'll fight about the other stuff. So I just want to point out that this is a tough issue. So there's accounts that say, what does it take to be morally responsible? Some of them are sort of what you might think of as metaphysical accounts, just meaning that they say what it takes to be morally responsible is things like, for instance, exercising the right amount of control, or having the right amount of agency, the right amount of autonomy, agency, or control over your action, and maybe even something like causing your action in the right way. And so control, causation, these kinds of things, they're metaphysical notions. They're not really getting into societal stuff, the social context that you're in. But there are accounts that do that focus on, instead of wondering, for instance, whether determinism is true, that is, wondering whether the laws of nature guarantee only one future, or if there's genuine alternatives in the going forward into the future. That's a metaphysical question. And so people say, well, you have to have a certain amount of control to be morally responsible. Then we need to know whether determinism is true, whether everything's determined, like what your brain's like, so we know if you had control over your action, all these kinds of things. Some other people think, well, actually, what's really important is that the social norms, say, or the social practices that we have surrounding responsibility. So if you want to know what it takes to be morally responsible, we just need to look at sort of the social context, the social norms, the social practices surrounding moral responsibility. And that's a famous sort of approach from Peter Strawson, who says, we don't need to think about metaphysical stuff. We don't need to think about whether determinism is true. What we need to think about when we wonder whether people are responsible for their actions, or what it takes, is what it means for us to appropriately hold someone responsible. And then that just takes us to the social stuff. We just look at our own human practices of holding people responsible and see what are the conditions for when that's appropriate and when it's not, right? So we don't hold babies responsible, for instance. Well, why is that? We don't hold severely cognitively disabled adults responsible, at least for certain things, or at least we hold them much less responsible. Why is that? Well, we look at the practices. So some people do that. Some people think it's about changing relationships, or the nature of relationships that we have with each other, which is, again, a social thing. And then some people kind of take from both of these very broad categories. This is very, very broad, very cursory. It's leaving many, many things out. But just to give you a brief overview. So some people focus on this stuff. Some people focus on this stuff. Some people try to mix them a little bit and say, well, it's about control, but it's also, we need to have some grounding in our social context. So all this to say, these are just really thorny issues, really complicated issues about what it takes to be morally responsible. And people fight over that, right? But this affects what conditions you think are essential. So the answer to this question, what it takes, will affect, it influences what you think's like most central, most important, right? Whether you think control, is most important to figuring out when someone is responsible or when people can be responsible, whether determinism is true, whether they need to know certain things, whether there's certain social practices that we need to bring in, whether there's certain interpersonal attitudes, reactive attitudes like resentment and gratitude, anger, blaming and praising attitudes. And again, like Scanlon, whether relationships are important are the central feature. So how you think about this question is just going to tell you what you think the most essential things are to responsibility. Okay. So all that to say, I mean, look, it's just responsibility is just really central to their debate. And then there's these really complicated issues about what responsibility in fact is, or maybe put differently, or focusing on a different idea, what it takes to be responsible, what needs to happen, what needs to be true in order for it to be true that someone is morally responsible, blameworthy or praiseworthy for something. Now, just for our own purposes here, we'll just think about responsibility in terms of deserving praise or blame. So you deserve blame if you do a wrong action, you deserve praise if you do a right action, and you deserve it just because you knowingly performed that right or wrong action. Okay, not for like consequentialist reasons. We don't want to think of responsibility in terms of producing really good outcomes. Like, oh, well, this person's morally responsible. They're blameworthy just in case, we can do some good work by holding them responsible. We can increase well-being just by holding them responsible. Therefore, we'll call them responsible. We don't want to do that. And so we're just going to think about responsibility in terms of deserving blame or praise just because what justifies or grounds deserving praise or blame is just the fact that someone knowingly performed a right or wrong action. And if it was right, they deserve praise. If it was wrong, they deserve blame. Okay, so moral responsibility is just going to be positive and negative responsibility. It's deserving blame or it's deserving praise. Just really kind of simplified version. All right, now there's a long-standing debate about whether determinism is a threat to moral responsibility. And determinism is just the idea that if you have some past state of the world, like think of like the initial conditions of the universe, and then you add some laws of nature, right? The laws about how things interact in the world, behave and interact. The past plus the laws of nature guarantee only one possible future. So at every moment, only one thing can happen at the next moment. That's determinism, okay? Now there's global determinism, which means every single moment at every moment in time, through all time, the whole history of the universe is determined. Or there's local determinism, where you can say, well, some pocket of the universe. So not the entire past, right? Not the whole entire universe, but because of the laws of nature and because of some sort of piece of the universe, like your brain, say, maybe some things can be determined. So if you have a certain brain state, neurodeterminism, or maybe you have some genetic makeup, that makes it so that some particular event is going to be determined. Okay, but maybe not everything, right? But just global versus local. So determinism is a kind of tricky issue too. That's kind of the point of this, is not to just be experts on determinism or anything like that, but just to say these are tricky issues. If you think that responsibility requires control, then, or the ability to do otherwise, then determinism might be a threat, right? And so the question is like, does being responsible does it require that we have genuine possibilities? Can we be responsible for something if there's only one thing we can do? Can we be responsible for that thing? If we just couldn't do anything else, if we literally had no possibility to do anything else other than action A, can we be responsible for A if we couldn't do anything else? That's a question. And determinism is involved in that question because determinism entails that there's only one possible future at any moment. So then it seems like we couldn't do otherwise. So these are just further issues, further questions about responsibility. And we'll look at, I don't want to get into this too much, so I'll just gloss over it. But related to this question are these debates. So some people think that having alternatives are not required. So you can be responsible for something even if you couldn't have done anything else. Okay? And here's a very, very simplified, and it's not really correct, but it'll get you the idea of what are called Frankfurt cases. So Harry Frankfurt is famous for arguing that you can be responsible without having the ability to do otherwise. Okay, but the basic idea is, imagine somebody's locked in a room and they don't know they're locked in the room. The door is locked, they can't open it, right? So even if they tried to open it, they couldn't get out. And then we ask whether they're responsible for staying in the room. But now imagine the reason they stayed in the room is not because they tried to get out and couldn't. They just decided on their own before they even tried to get out. Before they don't even know the door's locked, right? They think they can get out. But they just decide on their own to stay in the room, okay? But look, they couldn't have got out. There's nothing else they could have done but stay in the room, right? They couldn't do otherwise because the door's locked. Even if they tried, they couldn't do it. And so this is, again, that's not actually the way Frankfurt cases go. I want to note that. But it's good enough to get the idea, which is just that it seems like maybe there are times when we can be responsible for something, even though we couldn't have done otherwise. And the reason seems to be because we can maybe still do things on our own. Our actions can sort of flow from us in the right kinds of ways. So all that to say, again, Frankfurt just pushes back against this idea that you need to be able to do otherwise in order to be responsible. Okay, and then there's this other issue about manipulation. So if this is true, if determinism is true, that at any moment after the first moment, right, given some past and the laws of nature, there's only one possible future, right? If that's true, then it seems like some people say, well, then it's just the same thing as like being manipulated. It's almost like being manipulated by the universe. So the thought kind of goes like this. If you imagine some person who's deciding whether to do something, let's say something very bad, like kill someone else, right? But then unbeknownst to this person, there's a neuroscientist who has implanted a chip in their brain and is able to control them and basically just kind of messes with their deliberation process when they're deliberating about whether to do this and kind of ramps up their desire to do it. And that kind of causes them to do this thing that they were already thinking about, right? They're not like acting totally out of character. This is in line with, kind of what the type of person that they are. Not that they're like just crazy murderous, but they had these kinds of desires before. Sometimes they control them and act on them, or sometimes they've acted on them. But the point is just if you see that this person like has like a remote control, right, and is controlling their deliberation, pushes a button and ramps up their desire and makes them do this thing deterministically, it seems like this person's not responsible because they were determined to do this by this guy right here, the neuroscientist, who just like pressed a button which determined them to do that. So then the manipulation argument says, well, now just imagine instead of directly doing that, they do it to their zygote or their fertilized egg. They do it to them at like right before their birth or whatever. And so from childhood now, the neuroscientist has manipulated the egg or whatever it is, the fertilized egg, so that and they know based on the like laws of universe or whatever that will result in this person growing up to be this person and will perform that action. I don't want to get into the details of this. And I think it's already getting a little too much into the details, but the point is just to say some people think if determinism is true, that's going to be just like manipulation. There's no difference, they want to say, between a neuroscientist manipulating you outside of your control so that you ultimately perform some action that you were determined to do by something beyond your control. They say, well, determinism is just like that. If you have the universe over here, the beginning of the universe and the laws of nature just makes it so that you're determined at, this is like, let's say, what is it? Billions of years ago, right? Just the beginning of the universe, like billions of years ago, already it was determined that at this point in time, you would have, been born, grown up, and at this point in time, you were determined to deliberate in this particular way and make this particular decision to perform this particular action of killing this person. It was all determined by the beginning of the universe. So some people say, if that's true, it seems like it's just like manipulation by a neuroscientist. It's just that a neuroscientist isn't doing it, it's the universe doing it. It's kind of forcing you to perform the actions you perform. Okay, so that's the idea. And some people push back against that. So there's these two questions about whether you need the ability to do otherwise, whether determinism is a problem. And again, we're not going to talk about that. I just bring this up to say moral responsibility is really central to their debate. And there's all these really kind of complicated issues that go into that. So we just need to be kind of aware that there's background stuff here that is not really figured out yet, at least by these people. These people arguing about this. So keep that in mind. This is a limited conversation that they can have. It's not like they're doing something wrong. Glannon and Yen Ho are not doing something wrong by not going into all this detailed stuff about responsibility. That's just not the purpose of their paper. I just bring it up for us to just be careful, right? It's not everything is going to be, not every single detail can be worked out in these papers. So we need to be a little bit epistemically humble about the views that we take on these papers. Okay. All right. So turning back to addiction. Now, the disease debate over addiction, whether addiction is a disease or not, seems to have some parallels to the determinism debate. Determinism in responsibility and free will. Does determinism undermine responsibility? If everything's determined by the past and the laws of nature, right? There's only one thing we can do. That seems to be a threat to free will and responsibility. But in the same way, people think if addiction is a disease, then that seems to be a threat to the addict having control. The addict doesn't have control, isn't responsible for what they do if their addiction is a brain disease. That's the thought, anyways. People say things like, my brain made me do it, right? That's the idea. So if the thought seems to be from people who think that addiction is a disease, at least many of them, the thought seems to be, if something's a brain disease, that means then there's some neurological determinism, right? Maybe not the whole entire universe needs to be determined, but having a certain brain state or having a certain brain structure, right? Certain changes to the brain that get induced by being an addict or having an addiction determine certain behaviors. And so if you have a brain disease, then you get this neurological determinism. But then that means if you're determined to do stuff because of the way your brain is, then you don't have the ability to do otherwise. This is alternative possibilities. That's what that stands for. You don't have any alternative possibility except to do what your brain is making you do, right? And therefore, if you can't do anything else, then you can't be responsible. That's the idea. Okay? It's at least a strong idea in the addiction literature. So whether your addiction is a brain disease or a disease is similar to when people worry about whether the world is determined. They're worried that that's going to undermine responsibility. Now, Walter Glannon and Yen Ho say, they're arguing about these questions. Are addicts responsible for their behavior? Okay. And if they are, how would that affect what they deserve? Right. And then ultimately, should alcoholics get donor livers? Once we think about these questions, what should we think about whether alcoholics should get donor livers? Okay, so here's Walter Glannon. His main thesis is that at least many addicts, and in particular he's going to use alcoholics as the case study, but I think he'll say that it probably applies to other addictions. And it's not just about organ donation, it's just about healthcare resources. If you need healthcare, then obviously you need resources. You need either like objects, like organs, or substances like medicine, or a ventilator, say, or you just need labor. You need doctors and nurses to take care of you. So those are medical resources, right? And so the question is, should addicts, because of their condition, because of their role in their condition, should they be able to receive certain healthcare resources? That's the question. Right? And then he makes it more specific by focusing on alcoholics getting new livers because of cirrhosis. But he thinks at least many of them should not get new livers. Okay. So now he says, look, there's two ways to argue for this. You can have a medical argument, and you could say alcoholics don't deserve livers, or they shouldn't get livers for medical reasons. right? Because, well, they're really likely to relapse and continue drinking, and then they're just going to destroy the new liver that we give them. And so for medical reasons alone, their liver will be at higher risk than a non-alcoholic. And so it will be destroyed quicker. And so there's a kind of medical argument against giving alcoholics new livers. But that's not what he wants to say. Okay, that's not the argument that he wants to give. What he wants to say is the moral argument, or that's what he wants to give. He wants to say alcoholics, at least most of them, many of them, should not get new livers, but it's for moral reasons. It's because alcoholics don't deserve new livers, at least not as much, than other people, non-alcoholics, because they are morally responsible for the fact that they need a new liver. That's the main argument he's going to give. Okay, it is restricted a little bit. Again, so it says many addicts, right? Excuse me. I have to take a drink. It says many addicts. Well, why? Well, just being an alcoholic doesn't guarantee that you're responsible for that, right? And he recognizes that. So he's going to say many, maybe even most, but not necessarily all. But the focus here is going to be on, one, control, how much addicts control their actions, their drinking, and then foresight, how much should they be able to reasonably foresee or know about the consequences of their actions, right? All right, so what he says is about responsibility is that moral responsibility is just identifying with what he says, what he calls the springs of your action, right? The springs of your action. This comes from Harry Frankfurt as well, who is the Frankfurt case guy. But the idea is that in order to be responsible for something, for an action, what needs to happen is that action needs to kind of reflect your true self. It needs to be a reflection of your true self in a certain kind of way. Okay. And usually the kind of way, at least the Frankfurt way, is for that action to be caused, for an action to reflect your true self, is for it to be caused by you, by the things that are a part of your true self. And what are those things? The springs of action, the things that cause your action, need to be certain motivations, okay, that you endorse. So think of it this way. If you cause some action, if you perform some action, right, you need to have certain mental states like, I want to perform that action. I want my action to be in line with those desires that I have. I want to use drugs, say. I want to take a drink, whatever it is. You have to have these sort of more reflective thoughts that are like, yeah, I want that desire. That's a good desire to have. I want that desire to be effective, right? I want it to move me to perform those actions. And I like those actions. Those actions express my true self. So when you have those kinds of identification, right, this identification or endorsement of the desires and the motivations and the reasons and the things that move you, that's going to be really essential to what it means to be responsible. Okay, but you also still need some control. He still thinks you need some control. So he has four components to control. One, there we go, is not being coerced. This negative condition. It can't be true that you're coerced or compelled in order to have control. Secondly, your action has to be come from an autonomous choice, an autonomous capacity. So you have to have this capacity to sort of evaluate the reasons, evaluate your own beliefs, modify your beliefs, your intentions, and so on, that produce that action. Okay, so you have to have this capacity in order to say, hey, look, I have these desires to, let's say, drink alcohol, and I think those are bad desires because it's causing this harm, it's causing health problems, whatever else. And therefore, I need to try to modify my beliefs and my desires about how good it is to use alcohol or whatever it is. So this capacity for evaluating your own beliefs, evaluating the reasons you have to perform certain actions, and then modifying your beliefs and your actions ultimately based on that evaluation, okay, that's this kind of capacity for autonomy. So you can't be coerced or compelled from the outside. You need some internal capacity to move yourself according to reasons and according to reasoning. And you have to have the ability to kind of see the consequences. Right? You have to have this reasonable foreseeability. capacity to have known the risks, known the consequences, right? And then there has to be some what he calls causal sensitivity. Sometimes it's called a counterfactual influence or something like that. The counterfactual causation, that's what I'm looking for. The idea here is that it needs to be true. Glannon thinks that the last thing that you need in order to have control over your action is that if you had acted differently, then the consequences would have been different. That's what he thinks, part of what he thinks is needed in order to control your action. If you would have acted differently, then something else would have happened. Okay, the consequences would have changed. All right, so the health resources that we have are scarce. Okay, this is part of the reason why the moral argument even comes up, or this question even comes up, right? We just don't have enough livers for everyone that needs them. And that's the entire reason why we're even asking, at least a main reason, why we're asking, do alcoholics deserve new livers? If we just had an abundance of new livers to give everyone, I mean, maybe we would still ask this question for other reasons, but there's at least a really strong motivation that goes away if we have all the livers we need. One of the main motivations for thinking about stuff like this is that we have scarce resources, right? So that's one main motivation. The other is that control over our health, right? How much we control our state of health, it varies. Some people have genetic diseases that they can't help. Some people have environmental diseases that they can't help. Some people have environmental diseases that they can help and maybe choose not to. Some people get diseases or conditions just by their own voluntary behavior. You might think, for instance, like eating lots of junk food might give you heart disease or diabetes or whatever else. Sorry. And so the amount that we control our health varies. So because the amount we control our health varies, and because we don't have all the health resources we need for everyone, you get this question of how do we distribute healthcare resources? Right? And then so Glannon makes these sort of connections. He says, look, there's a link between control and desert in healthcare. There's a link between how much you control your health and then how much healthcare you deserve. And it goes kind of like this. The treatment that you deserve is a function of the responsibility that you have for that disease. So the treatment that you deserve for some disease correlates to how responsible you are for having that disease. That's one place he starts. How responsible you are for having a disease correlates with, or is a function of, how responsible you are for the events that cause that disease. Okay. And so how responsible you are for the events that cause that disease is a function of, or results from, or correlates with how much control you had over that event. So how much treatment you deserve for cirrhosis of the liver, let's say failing liver, depends on how responsible you are for having a failed liver. Well, how responsible you are for having a failed liver depends on how responsible you are for what caused you to have a failed liver. Like, for instance, drinking a whole bunch. Now, how responsible you are for those events that caused your liver failure depends on, or is a function of, how much you controlled those events, how much you controlled that drinking, for instance. Okay, so these are just kind of these conceptual connections that he made between how much you deserve, how much healthcare you deserve, and how much control you exercise. That's the kind of link, right? And the basis for this is that, look, we should help those if it isn't their fault, right? We should help people who are harmed or in need if it's not their fault. That's what he thinks is kind of an intuition, right? And if it is their fault, we should help them less. At least when we have, we have to make a decision between two people or two groups of people, and we have scarce resources, we can only pick one. He thinks if one of them caused themselves to be in that condition and the other one didn't, then we should help the one who didn't. Right? Well, why? Because it's unfair for those who do exercise their control, who are careful, take care of themselves, right? To incur costs. Costs mean that go to costs in the sense that they lose out on healthcare that someone else gets, right? Incur costs to those who didn't. And that just means the other people get the stuff that they lost, right? And because of them, because of those people not controlling themselves, right, they're losing out on healthcare. And he says that seems unfair. Right? Someone who exercised control, took care of themselves, they suffer a cost, which is not getting some healthcare, and they lose that healthcare to someone else who didn't control themselves. He thinks that's unfair. And so we, the government, healthcare institutions, whoever else, should help those in need or those who are harmed according to how much control they exercised over the fact that they're in that position. Okay. Now, he says alcoholics do have control. That's what he thinks. Okay. So being an addict does not undermine control according to Walter Glannon. That's what he thinks. Here's what he says. If alcoholics have control over the events that lead to cirrhosis, but fail to exercise it, and if non-alcoholics with cirrhosis or some other form of, end-stage liver disease where their liver's failing and they need a new liver, if they do exercise this control and yet it befalls them through no fault of their own, it being if the failed liver befalls them through no fault of their own, then it seems both reasonable and fair to conclude that alcoholics should be given lower priority than non-alcoholics in receiving a liver transplant. One of them exercised control, and they just got the liver disease through no fault of their own. The other one didn't exercise control, right, and got liver disease because of that. He thinks, well, you should give it to the one who did exercise control. And he appeals to people like Mark. Well, he doesn't appeal to them in the article in particular, but he appeals to work. He may actually, I forget, but he appeals to work in the addiction literature by people like Mark Lewis and Hannah Picard, who argue that addiction does not necessarily undermine control, at least not in the way that the brain disease people think that it does, right? They're not compelled just because they have an addiction. It's not equivalent to being coerced, okay? They do maintain autonomy and choice and identification. There are willing addicts. Think about, this is a common example, think about people who are heavily addicted to smoking, maybe smoke like 2 packs a day or something. They don't smoke on planes, right? You're not allowed to. Of course, some people do, right? Maybe there's some extreme cases or some people that just don't care. But most cigarette smokers don't smoke on planes. That seems like a little bit of control there, doesn't it? So these are the kinds of examples that these people appeal to, right? They're not therefore ignorant. Just because you're an addict doesn't mean you're ignorant of the consequences or of what you're doing, right? And Hannah Picard actually talks about ignorance a lot. And then their actions still make a difference, right? Their actions still make a difference to their own addiction, right? Whether or not they choose to get treatment, whether or not they choose to hang out with certain people, whether or not they choose to try to ask their family for help, whatever else. Those kinds of questions are going to, or those kinds of actions, the decisions that they make, are going to affect their addiction, like whether it goes away, how severe it is, and so on. That's the thought behind all this stuff. So simply being an addict, these people want to say, does not necessarily undermine control. And if that's true, if alcoholics have control over the events that lead to their liver failure, but they don't exercise it, then it seems like they deserve a new liver less than other people, in particular non-alcoholics, who did exercise control and tried to take care of themselves, but for no fault of their own, they ended up with some liver disease, maybe genetic, whatever. Okay, that's the thrust of the argument. Now, he's going to consider some objections. Glannon's going to say, okay, some people might say, for instance, I think there's 2 challenges. Some people might say, wait, hey, addiction is a brain disease, therefore addicts aren't responsible. And these are people like Nora Volkow, George Koob, who run the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And they say, look, there's these neurological changes that happen in the brain for addicts. There's these, that's the word I'm looking for, systematic changes to the brain in addiction. Structural changes, so how the matter, like actual to your brain matter, and then functional changes as well. So the brain functions differently, and the brain is physically, structurally different in addicts. That's the claim, at least on average, systematically. And they think that this gives the addict a kind of neurological, neurobiological, or genetic determinism, right? The brain that addicts have and the genes that they have at least very closely determine some of their behavior. That's roughly the idea. The sort of tagline is that their brain made them do it, right? They couldn't have done otherwise. They couldn't help themselves because addiction is a brain disease, and in particular, Nora Volkow says things like, it's a disease of free will. It's a disease to the circuits of your brain, the areas and circuits and pathways in your brain that are specifically involved in exercising control and free will. Okay, and because of that, addicts don't have free will, and therefore they can't be held morally responsible. At the very least, they're much less responsible than non-addicts. Okay, and so they're like, it's saying that, you know, the desires to use in addiction and the choices they made, it's analogous to insulin being produced in diabetics, just sort of against their will, you know, like it's not done on purpose, intentionally. It's just because of their biological makeup, they overproduce insulin. And because an addict has a disease, they sort of overproduce these extra strong desires, overproduce these choices to use. Okay, the dysfunction is precisely a dysfunction of motivation and control and desires. That's the thought. Okay, because of that, addicts aren't responsible for what they do, at least to a much lower degree, and therefore they're not going to be responsible for having developed cirrhosis. Okay, now here's what Glannon says to the disease debate. 3 things. 1, it's really implausible that genes determine our behavior. Okay, genes are at most predispositions to certain behaviors, and I think he's right about this. We don't know a whole lot about genetic predisposition for most mental health issues like addiction. Other ones, of course, you know, if you have a certain gene mutation, then that's just going to give you a certain disease. But addiction is just so far from that. We just don't know that much about the genetic influences on addictive behavior. There's just a little bit, you know, and it seems like there's some evidence that there's some genetic component to addiction, but it's just really unclear how that works right now. Okay. Now, so he's got a point here, but also he says, look, the environment matters anyways. So I mean, you're not going to get determinism with genes, especially in addiction, because we just don't know that much about it yet. So, okay, so you're not going to get determinism. That seemed to be part of what they were saying. Sorry about that. And then you get also this other worry, like, look, even if having a certain brain state, even if getting an addict brain does determine your actions, you can get this transfer principle going. Responsibility at an earlier time for having that sort of brain, for becoming an addict, can transfer to the other consequences, like using. So think of drunk driving, right? If you're drunk driving, and let's say you're like blackout drunk, right? You have no control over what you're doing behind the wheel. You're not intending to hit someone. You're not intending to speed, to veer. You're not intending to do anything. You're blackout drunk, right? But most people think, we can still hold you responsible because of this transfer principle, because you were responsible for becoming drunk and not appropriately taking steps to like put your keys away or give them to a friend or whatever, right? So similarly with addiction, even if your brain as an addict does determine you to use, and therefore you maybe aren't responsible directly for using and causing yourself to get liver failure, you're responsible for becoming an addict, right? It's like type 2, adult onset diabetes. Like, this is not something you're born with. This is something that you cause because of your behaviors. Okay? And they want to say the same thing about addiction. Even if you don't control your insulin production once you get diabetes, you can be responsible for getting it. Same thing. Even if you don't control your drug use, once you become an addict, you can still be responsible for becoming an addict. And so even if it is a disease that determines you, Glannon wants to say, we still have to worry about this. Maybe you're responsible for becoming an addict still. And that will make you responsible for what you do as an addict, because you should have foreseen those consequences. Now, this is Justin Ross Harris, who was sort of famously, it's been a little while now, I don't know how social media was not that crazy back then, I guess. But in any case, this was a guy who left his kid here, his 2-year-old, in the car. It's a hot car death case. And he got charged with malice murder, actually, intentional malice murder, for a kind of negligence. And so he was, and it's based on this transfer principle, right? Even if his forgetting his son in the car was not under his control. I mean, it's kind of the idea, right? When you forget something, you don't control it. It just didn't come to your mind. You just forgot he was back there, and went into work. The short story is, they went on this same route every day when he picked when it was his turn to pick his son up and take him to daycare, or take him in the morning or whatever before work. They would go on the same route. They would stop at Chick-fil-A, eat, and then he would take him to daycare, and we go to work. And it was one of these things where you're driving, you accidentally turn left because you have like 2 routes, one to work, one to home, let's say, and they overlap in parts. And it was kind of like that, according to his story anyways. And he forgot he was back there. He didn't go to daycare. He forgot he was back there, went into work, and he was out there all day, and he died. So that's the short version. So there's a kind of negligence of forgetting here. But the idea is, if he was responsible for not taking steps earlier for doing something, checking, whatever, making sure, putting his wallet or his work briefcase or whatever in the back seat just to make sure he would go back there, those kinds of things. So the point is just, you might be kind of determined by your brain if you're an addict, but if you're responsible for being an addict in the first place, then that still matters. The third thing is identification with your desires. So an addict can still identify with what they're doing. Even if they're determined, an addict can say, yeah, I like these desires. I like what I'm doing. I endorse it. This is who I want to be. This is part of my true self. So even if they can't help it, you might think, at least willing addicts who don't care to change their behavior and endorse what they're doing, maybe they can be responsible even if they can't help it. So that's his response to the disease challenge. Then there's the second challenge, this virtue and vice challenge. So what this says is, look, denying alcoholics new livers that need them is punishing someone for how they live, for a way of living, a vice. There's drinking too much is a vice, right? It's a unvirtuous lifestyle choice, you might say. But look, we all succumb to vices, right? We eat the midnight snack when we're on a diet, right? We procrastinate and don't get our work done when we should. These are vices, right? And denying an alcoholic a life-saving liver punishes them for a lifestyle that we don't agree with and that we don't like, right? And here's the first idea is, look, it's not relevant to treatment, this like moral evaluation of someone's lifestyle. That's one idea, right? There's no consensus on what the virtuous and vicious lifestyles are, right? We can't deny treatment based on lifestyle. Imagine someone who just decided, like, look, what I want to do is just eat kind of the way I want. I just want to eat junk food or whatever, and I don't really care if I get overweight and causes health problems. I'm going to live my life and do that because I enjoy this food or whatever, right? Are we going to deny that person like an ambulance when they have a heart attack, someone calls and like, oh, wait, tell me, what's their eating style like? Did they do this to themselves? Like, this is just not a question we ask, right? We just send the ambulance. And so the idea is moral evaluation is not relevant to what kinds of treatment people deserve. The second part of this challenge is that the cause of the disease is not relevant, right? So moral evaluation of the lifestyle is not relevant, and what caused the disease is not relevant. And Glannon appeals to this University of Minnesota Bioethics Center. They had this task force to kind of like investigate, I guess, this question. And there's a quote in there that he uses. And the basic point here is just, look, there's a task force on bioethics. They had analyzed this question and did some research. And their conclusion was the cause of the disease should just not be relevant, right? We treat the condition that the person has. We treat pathologies, dysfunctions, disorders. We do not treat conditionally. We don't say, I will treat you on the condition that you have this agreeable or approvable lifestyle. Right? That's just not what we do. We treat conditions. We don't treat conditionally. All right, that's the challenge. So what does Glannon say in response to this? He says, look, this just misses the point, right? It's not about their bad lifestyle. That's not what it's about. Glannon says, you're just objecting to me for something that I'm not even saying. I'm not saying that they don't deserve livers because they have a bad lifestyle, a vicious lifestyle. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is they can control their actions. And because they can control their actions, they are morally responsible for those actions. And if that's true, then what they are entitled to in terms of healthcare, because remember, we have scarce resources, we can't treat everybody. So the fact that they can control themselves and are responsible to a significant degree, right? That means that they're entitled to less. That's what I'm saying. Not because they have a lifestyle that we disapprove of. And so he thinks it just misses the point. And he's like, look, control and character come apart. You can have good character and more control, good character and less control, bad character and more or less control, right? His character just doesn't tell us anything about how much control someone exercises over their action. A really bad person can exercise a lot of control, right? And a really bad person can be manipulated or brainwashed. And similarly for good people. So the person's character is just independent of the control that they have over their actions and thus how responsible they are for that. So that's why he says this misses the point. Because he's interested in this stuff, not this stuff. Okay. And focusing on this stuff, on how much control the addict has, how responsible they are, that actually affirms the autonomy of the addict. That's just like focusing on that stuff instead of their character is a way to focus on something that's going to make them want to be more autonomous, maybe even give them the ability to be more autonomous by thinking in those terms, thinking about the control that they can exercise, right? And the second line here is we don't punish people, or we're not punishing the alcoholic for doing something wrong. That's not the idea. We're distributing scarce resources, scarce goods, based on how much people deserve them. And desert comes down to how much you controlled yourself, how responsible you are. It's not like we're saying, your drinking is morally wrong, therefore you don't deserve. That's not what we're doing. We're saying, look, we don't have all the livers we need. Scarce goods, scarce resources. We don't have all the livers we need. Therefore, we need to figure out who gets them. And we got to just figure out who deserves what. That's going to be based on desert, right? So what you're entitled to, what you deserve, is partly a function of how much control you exercise. Right? So here's an example. He's like, imagine somebody, I know these are kids, but imagine somebody has this predisposition to melanoma, skin cancer. And maybe it's because they have really pale skin or whatever else, right? But then they say, I don't care. I know I have a predisposition. I know I'm really likely to get skin cancer if I'm out in the sun. But you know what? I don't care. I'm gonna wear no sunscreen. I'm gonna wear tank tops, short shorts, and I'm gonna go lay out on the beach every day. And then let's say they get skin cancer, right? And now they need treatment, expensive treatment that takes up a lot of scarce resources. What this challenge says is like, well, how much you control yourself, or sorry, not the challenge. This is the response from Glannon. Sorry about that. He's gonna say, look, we should just give these people less resources. They deserve less resources because they know the consequences. They know that if they do this behavior that they can control, right? They don't have to do, then they're going to cost us a bunch of money and resources later down the line. And they said that they don't care and they're doing it anyways. Other people have these kinds of conditions or need similar treatments or whatever through no fault of their own, for genetic or other environmental reasons that they didn't know of or that they didn't control. And so how much you control your actions will determine how responsible you are for those actions, and therefore how much you control and are responsible for the results of those actions. Okay, we're not punishing the addict for doing something wrong. What we're doing is we're seeing how much they deserve based on how much control they exercised. Okay, and how much they deserve will tell us how much resources they should get. All right, so here is what Glannon's, the wrap up of Glannon is. Okay, so responsibility counts. Okay, responsibility counts He says, look, there's this United Network for Organ Sharing that revised their policy. This is 2016. So that the priority went to the sickest person, the most eminent risk, right? Like acute liver failure instead of chronic liver disease or whatever. Someone's liver's failing right now, and they're going to die next week if they don't get another liver. This is a solely medically motivated policy revision. It just says whoever's going to die first, that's who gets the liver, right? But then Glannon says, well, look, what if somebody just goes out into the forest, finds some mushrooms, they know they're poisonous, and they're like, man, I'm just going to go crazy today. I don't even care if I end up in the hospital. And they just eat the mushrooms. And now they have acute liver failure, let's say, and they need treatment or they're going to die. Well, like, what about the people who have liver disease through no fault of their own for some genetic thing, and they've been waiting for a liver, and finally one comes up, and let's just pretend that it matches the person who ate the mushrooms and the person who's been living with liver disease for 5 years, let's say, and they're just in terrible agony for the last 3 of them, right? Now they're barely hanging on, but they could hang on for, another year or so, and this person's going to die immediately because they ate these mushrooms. That's like, what if this is the only liver we're going to have? That's the kind of point he's making, is if you had to choose, if there was only one liver to give them and you had to choose, this policy says, let's use medical stuff only, give it to the sickest, most imminent risk, therefore we should give it to the person who's having acute liver failure because they knowingly and freely ingested these poisonous mushrooms, versus the person who is suffering from a liver failure and will also die, but through no fault of their own. It's like, look, we have to prioritize sometimes. This is just what happens. I know it sounds like a crazy example, but the structure of that example is happening every day. We have to decide who gets some of the scarce resources. And he thinks fairness should count. What's fair should count. Okay, and what's fair is very tightly connected to whether you're responsible for the condition you're in. Okay, and whether you're responsible is going to depend on how much control you exercised, right? And how much foreknowledge you had over the consequences of your actions, right? And he says, look, it might be hard to determine this stuff, but it's our duty because theoretically, conceptually, we should be doing this fairly. That's going to be connected to how responsible you are, and that's going to be connected to how much control and foresight you exercise over your actions. Okay. So, in conclusion, many, perhaps most, alcoholics who need a liver transplant should at least be more lowly, should at least be given a lower priority, if not outright denied a new liver, because of their responsibility over their actions. Okay, now let's look at the second paper. So Dienho responds directly to Glannon. He wrote this paper in response to Walter Glannon's paper. Okay, and his main point is going to be responsibility should not count. Well, really, there's 2 main points. Addicts are not responsible. That's one line he tries to consider. But also responsibility shouldn't count. And see this nice little, I realize your finger hurts and that you're angry because another person went before you. But he did have an arrow sticking out of his head. It's just like the kind of opposite conclusion of what we just saw, right? Like, well, maybe we shouldn't just do responsibility stuff. Maybe we should do this medical stuff, right? Like, if someone's going to die right now, maybe this person can wait. If they can wait, then maybe they should wait. So we can try to save everyone, right? Maybe that extra time that this other person has will be beneficial because maybe we can find extra resources in the meantime or something like that. All right, so what does Dienho say? Responsibility should not count. Well, why? He says, look, Walter Glannon and other people try to make this move from these 2 things, control and moral responsibility count when we're trying to figure out who deserves what kinds of healthcare resources. And 2, alcoholics do have control, and they're responsible. They move from those 2 things to we should deny livers or at least lower the priority for many alcoholics. Okay, so first he says, I'm going to try to object to 2. Okay, we should not think that alcoholics have control. Second, he's going to say, even setting that aside, even if they do have control and moral responsibility are not the kinds of things we should consider when we're thinking about how to distribute healthcare resources. Either they're going to be irrelevant or they're going to be outweighed. Okay, now let's go to the first point. The disease debate is totally irrelevant. So Glannon kind of focuses on this disease debate a lot. And Dien Ho says, whether alcoholism is a disease is completely irrelevant. The logical term for that is a red herring. It's just like you're bringing in this thing to try to like make it sound better or something like that, or to distract people. It really doesn't have anything to do with whether alcoholics should get new livers or not, or the kinds of healthcare treatment that they should get. Okay. He says, like, look, maybe it matters whether responsibility and control is involved. Do addicts control themselves? And he's going to address that in a second. It's like, maybe that matters, but whether alcoholism is a disease does not matter. Disease and responsibility come apart. You can have a disease and be completely unresponsible for it, have through no control of your own. And you can have a disease through control and responsibility. You can knowingly and freely drink a bunch of poison and give yourself a disease, right? So they come apart. Just because you're responsible or in control of your action or the state that you're in doesn't mean it's a disease. Just because you're not in control doesn't mean it's a disease. They come apart. And then the onset and the effects of the disease are controllable, right? At least sometimes, right? The onset of a disease might be controllable. Whether your insulin's acting up might be controllable, because it's whether or not your diabetes is acting up. Whether or not you're giving yourself the insulin injections, right? So sometimes you can control the effects of a disease, the onset of a disease, right? But not other things about the disease. But uncontrolled events are not necessarily diseases, right? So the point here, again, is just that responsibility and disease come apart. So maybe this matters, but he thinks this does not matter. If we did a bunch of work and we found out that addiction was not a disease, not a brain disease, that does not yet tell us that there's no control there, or that there is control there, I should say. So Dien Ho thinks that disease and control come apart, right? Every time you get control, that doesn't mean you don't have a disease. Every time you get no control or no responsibility, that does not mean you have a disease, and vice versa. Okay. All right, so he thinks that's just a distracting thing that Glannon did, was talk about disease. Okay, so are alcoholics responsible? Well, some people think that they do, right? Robert Veach and Walter Glannon think that there is control there, and that's part of the reason why they think that alcoholics should not get new livers, or at least be lower, have a lower priority. And then Moss and Siegler have this paper where they think that responsibility for seeking treatment is what matters, right? They're responsible. Maybe they don't have control over their drug use or their drinking, but they're still responsible for getting help. And so those who don't and end up getting like liver disease, they're going to be responsible in that sense, and therefore that's going to be the justification. So some do think that they're responsible, either directly for their actions, or they're responsible for like seeking treatment. And then if they don't seek treatment, then they're going to be blameworthy for having the disease. Okay. Now, there's good reasons, though, to think that control is compromised in addiction. There's good reasons to think at least less control, and therefore you're going to have less responsibility. Okay, so there's good reasons. So there's some neurobiological reasons. So Nora Volkow and George Koob, who I showed earlier, who are proponents of the disease model, they've done some good work to show that there's definitely some changes to the brain for people who are at least categorized as addicts in these studies. That there's stronger motivations. There's maybe like less ability to have impulse control, to think about future values, things like this. So there is some reason to think that there's less control, right? But Dien Ho says, suppose they are responsible, right? Let's just suppose they are. There's good reasons to think that control is actually compromised, he thinks. But he says, look, even if they are responsible, you have some epistemic worries, meaning you have these worries about how we can know what to do, even if they are responsible. It's unclear how to make comparative judgments of degree, meaning it's unclear to know how to say this alcoholic is more in control than this alcoholic. Well, how do we know? Like, what's determining the degree there? Alcoholic versus a non-alcoholic. Like, how do you determine what the degrees of control and responsibility are between different addicts, and then between addicts and non-addicts, and maybe some gray area, right? How do we determine all that? It's just unclear, right? And on Glannon's system, it seems like we're going to have to be able to make these judgments, but it's unclear how we can. And even if you do make that, like, what are the corresponding penalties? So how much penalty should you have for this much control? How much penalty should you have for this much control, right? It's just really unclear, right? And he says a healthcare system should be fair consistently, but it couldn't be consistently fair if we had to make these kinds of judgments, because these judgments are really, really unclear. So we'd be having to make kind of educated guesses, right? And there may be differences in opinion over the theories about what makes someone more or less in control. How to make the penalties proportional to the actions. So it's really unclear. So are alcoholics responsible? He thinks there's good reason to think that their responsibility is mitigated, at least, is less. But even if it's not, it's really hard to know how we're going to decide what makes one alcoholic more in control than another one. We need an account of control. We need an account of something that tells us what the difference in degrees are, right? So it's just hard to do. Okay. And so then he says, so this was the argument that alcoholics maybe are not responsible. And even if they are and don't have control, and even if they do, that stuff is going to be really hard to work out. So this claim, alcoholics have control and responsibility, is either false or it's not going to matter because we're not going to be able to figure out the differences anyways and incorporate them into a healthcare system about distributing goods in a consistently fair way. Okay, so now we're going to address this one. Does control even count? So he says, look, even if even if addicts are in control and have responsibility should not matter for distributing healthcare goods. Okay, the idea is here. Healthcare is a right. It's not a privilege. That's the tagline. Okay, the simplified tagline. Now, suppose we solved all the problems, right, previously, of whether addicts have control, how we can figure out differences in control, right, using control and responsibility for treating diseases, for deciding who gets the healthcare and who doesn't, has some problems. Okay, first, how is it determined when responsibility matters? Because it seems like sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't, right? So, for instance, insurance liability, whether you're responsible matters. Whoops. Oh boy, sorry about that. Sorry. So the point is, sometimes it seems like responsibility matters, and sometimes it doesn't. It's like relief agencies, education. We just don't ask those kinds of questions. When there's like a natural disaster or whatever, we just go help, right? Or even other things like, for instance, not just natural disaster relief, but poverty, homelessness, sex trafficking, these kinds of things I consider a kind of relief agency, rescuing people from these like terrible conditions. We just don't ask about responsibility. We just try to relieve all that terrible suffering, right? Same with education. We're just not asking about responsibility. We're just providing this good, this social good, so that we can get certain kinds of benefits later or whatever else. Or because people just have a fundamental right to it, right? But sometimes it does matter, right? Sometimes it does matter. But the question here is, what makes organ donation count as something that where as a domain where responsibility matters, right? How do we determine that? Okay, so that's one thing he says the Glannon just doesn't even address, right? Secondly, Relatedly, I guess, there's a question about the right to healthcare, right? It seems like this situation is with the alcoholics needing livers. It's a life and death situation, right? And most of the time, it seems we think people have a fundamental right to healthcare if we're in life and death situations, at least to the extent that we can give it to them, right? And so, of course, we acknowledge that there's scarce resources, but the thing that something that shouldn't matter here, if we're in a life and death situation, is how responsible someone is for getting themselves into that situation. That's Tien Ho's point. We wouldn't think, this life and death situation, someone's going to burn to death in a building, but unless they jump out, it's like, oh, hold on. Were you doing something reckless in there to cause this fire? If you were, we're going to kind of like adjust our safety net here a little bit, and now you're going to have less of a chance of surviving because you were a little bit responsible. It just like seems crazy, Tien Ho thinks. We just save people, right? We save people when they need saving. Okay. Second, he thinks having responsibility matter to healthcare. So making healthcare decisions, at least partly based on whether the person's responsible for needing healthcare, is going to be a really big problem for how medicine functions. Okay, so it's supposed to be a trusting fiduciary relationship, meaning that the doctor's supposed to have your interest in mind. Right? The fiduciary means he or she, the doctor is in this fiduciary relationship with you. What that means is they care, they're supposed to care, they're supposed to have your interests in mind when they make decisions, right? They have the expert information, but they're supposed to keep your interests in mind, okay? And you're supposed to trust them, right? Because they're the experts, right? They have a lot of the knowledge, but they're supposed to have your interests in mind. We have to respect autonomy, right? We have to respect the patient's own personal values, their autonomy, their capacity to govern themselves, to refuse treatment if they want. And if moral responsibility matters, then trust is going to be jeopardized. You're going to get this like stigma kind of thing. Do I tell my doctor that I use drugs? Because if responsibility matters to the kind of treatment that I get, then I don't want to tell them that I'm using drugs. Then they're going to think that my health problems are caused by that. They're going to think I'm responsible for that. And then they're not going to treat me as well. Okay, without trust in your doctor or the healthcare system in general, you just don't get optimal treatment. It's at least really harder, a lot harder to get. And that may be a number of different reasons. It might be because you just don't seek treatment. Okay, when trust is undermined, you're not going to get optimal treatment if you're not seeking treatment, right? And then it's just going to cause these other problems in actual healthcare situations, right? Like the possibility that the patient's going to not reveal certain information because they're worried about what the doctor's going to think or do. You might get biases, even like stronger biases from doctors. So that's a problem as well. Third, responsibility shouldn't matter because it's inconsistent with what we normally do. Okay. It's inconsistent with our other practices. So we already do not care about responsibility for lots of other things that require healthcare, at least in some situations. So speeding, you get in a wreck. Are you responsible for speeding? Were you texting and driving? When someone calls in an ambulance and says there was a really bad wreck, there's these, 2 people that are trapped in the car. Please get here fast. We can't get them out. We need help. Blah blah blah. What does the dispatcher say, or the ambulance when they get dispatched? Oh, hold on. Was the person texting? Because if they were texting, then they're kind of responsible for that. And so maybe we'll go take this other. We'll wait for another call, or we'll go all the way farther across town and help someone else. Because they caused it, they're responsible. No, we just don't do that. That's not what we do. If there's a gun accident, right? Responsibility matters for other stuff, like whether we should prosecute the person later, but it doesn't matter for sending the ambulance and helping them, right? In practice, it doesn't matter. So his point is like this practice of like making responsibility over your actions matter to whether you get treatment and healthcare. We just don't do that. We help people who get in wrecks, even if it's their fault they were speeding. We help people who get accidentally shot, or whatever. Like accidentally shot, even though they're responsible for like messing with a gun. We send an ambulance if a toddler wanders into the pool area because someone left the gate open and is now unconscious. You call 911 for that. The ambulance, the dispatcher, they're not going to say, well, hold on a second. Is anybody blameworthy for leaving the gate open? It's just like, we just don't do that, right? So, okay. Other values might outweigh responsibility, right? So the value of like the patient's rights, the patient's autonomy, the trust in the healthcare system, maybe even just consequentialist values like getting the best results. So responsibility is not the only thing that matters. But also, we just think we should just allow people to engage in risky behavior. So if someone wants to go skydiving or bungee jumping and they get into a serious accident and they need life-saving treatment, we don't say, you know what, you shouldn't have been engaging in that behavior. You knew the consequences, you knew the risks. That's just not what we do. And his point is just, that's the trying to say that it matters for alcoholics and liver transplants is just inconsistent with what we do normally. And also he's like, at the end, he's like, there may be this weird result too. So think of this. People who don't smoke live longer on average. And therefore, they get a lot more health care. It's more expensive. Non-smokers end up being overall more expensive because they live longer. And therefore, they're going to have more healthcare costs. And so, but they're intentionally, freely, responsibly choosing not to smoke, right? But if they're doing that and then they incur more healthcare costs because they live longer, should we lower their priority for general healthcare? Because they're gonna need more general healthcare because of this decision not to smoke. That's a weird result, right? There's kind of an interesting little point he makes at the end. All right, so here is Dien Ho's objections, and this will basically be the end. Even if responsibility counts, determining the specifics, what the difference is between two people, right? Like how this person's responsible to degree X, this other person's responsible to degree Y. Like determining the specifics of that is really, really hard. And it's, he thinks, too hard to make the policy decisions that we would need in order to be consistent and fair. So we shouldn't do it. But even if we could do that, right? Even if we could determine which alcoholics were responsible, to what degree, how to do the right kinds of penalties for the different kinds of degrees, enforcing that policy would undermine the commitments we have about the function of medicine, right? Having trusting relationships, the importance of patients' values, the effective treatment that we can give them. Okay. And then finally, this policy is just inconsistent with the way in which we think about lifestyle choices, right? We let people go bungee jumping without having to worry about whether they're going to get treatment if they get hurt, right? Okay. And it's just more valuable than sorry. Oh, okay. Right. So this kind of policy is inconsistent in our thinking about which lifestyle choices are more valuable and worth life-saving treatment, okay? It's just inconsistent. We just don't do that in other places, and Glannon doesn't really give us any reason to think that it should be any different here for alcoholics. Okay. All right, that's it. I'll put this stuff up on Canvas for next week. Thanks.